All right, our first session today will be the first of two historical cartography panels. We will begin today with Gilles Palsky. Gilles Palsky is a geographer and professor emeritus from, and I'm going to slaughter this, Paris en Panthéon-Sorbonne University. Close, maybe. Trained at the École normale supérieure of St. Cloud, he holds an agrégation, a PhD, and an accreditation to direct research, all in geography. He has taught subjects ranging from cartography to urban planning and was a key member of the research unit in epistemology and history of geography at the French National Center for Scientific Research. Gilles has chaired the History of Cartography Commission in France and was a founding trustee of the International Society for the History of the Map. His research focuses on the role of images in the construction of scientific knowledge and on the history of thematic maps and atlases between the 18th and 20th century. He is also working on several theoretical issues in cartography, visualization of spatial dynamics, participatory mapping, and semiology of graphics. This morning, Gilles applies his expertise to the topic of the albums des Statistique, Graphique. He'll delve beyond the visual allure to examine how these atlases influenced statistical objectivity and whom they were really designed for. The title of Gilles' talk today is Legitimizing Administrative Statistics in the, oh my goodness, 14th century France. What's 19th? Sorry, I'm not good with the Roman numerals. The album des Statistique, Graphique in context and their aims and audiences. Please join me in welcoming Gilles Palsky.
I have to change. So good morning. Well, I feel very honored to have been invited to this conference in this prestigious place. And I'd like to start by saying a big thank you to Barry Lawrence Ruderman, to the whole staff at the David Ramsay Map Center, and of course to David himself. So my talk today will focus on a kind of masterpiece of 19th century statistical data representation, the album The Statistique Graphique. There are a series of 18 atlases published by the French Ministry of Public Works from 1879 to 1906 under the direction of Émile Chesson. They total 428 plates, mainly maps, and about 15% of curves and diagrams. These albums have mostly been considered as a series of images described on the basis of the graphical method used and sometimes giving rise to aesthetic considerations. For example, Funkhauser, who rediscovered the albums in 1937, judged that they present the finest specimens of French graphic work in the century, and considerable pride was taken in them by the French people, statisticians and laymen alike. My talk today will be quite different and perhaps a little frustrating, since I won't be focusing directly on the graphic content, but I'll be proposing some thought around the questions: what were albums for and for whom? This publication, unique in its scope and cost, what were its stated objectives, and which audiences were targeted? Finally, I'll examine the discrepancy between Chesson's intentions regarding the graphic method and the results he obtained. I'll be using sources relating to the album circulation, but also their introductory texts written by Chesson, these forewords, ranging from half a page to 17 pages, accompany all volumes of the series, with the exception of the last. At first glance, they are purely descriptive, but they also reveal implicit theoretical positions. I move on to my first part, building objectivity. The albums emanated from a ministerial office and were clearly part of a documentary practice linked to administration. Chesson returned several times to his primary mission, which was, he said, to provide facts, information, and raw materials. We would readily associate albums with the image of a vast database, visual database. The use of maps and diagrams makes it possible to gather, condense, and display facts, which then speak for themselves without the need for an interpreter. I quote Chesson. The next albums will tell to what extent these forecasts have been realized. This is what statistics will say later on. We must now let the facts speak for themselves. They alone can say the last word on these serious reforms. The presentation of raw facts is unquestionably coupled with the construction of an objectivity based on statistical neutrality, expressed through a variety of rhetorical and graphic devices. Firstly, confidence was instilled in the collection of numbers by explaining in the foreword the care and rigor of administrative recording procedures. Secondly, the rejection of all interpretation and hence all subjectivity was a leitmotif of Chesson's texts. He proclaimed a kind of division of labor between those who produced the data and those who could learn from them. The administration provided materials and refrained from interpreting them, remaining neutral. The statistical machine claimed to exhibit reality without intervening in it, approaching a mechanical objectivity as described for scientific photography. Thirdly, the graphic processes were as mathematically rigorous as ever. The figures were systematically reproduced with the images so as not to lose any of their precision, as you can see on this map, for example. Finally, graphic methods were based almost exclusively on the geometry of proportional figures or graduated hues. No pictograms or figurative elements, except unexpectedly in a single plate of the last album, this one. However, the claim to neutrality is hardly convincing. Statistics does not produce a snapshot of reality. It constructs it through its categories, the adjustments it makes between data to make them compatible, and the objectives it sets itself. In fact, on several occasions, Chesson's texts offered interpretations or opinions that reflected the point of view of his administration and state engineers. They were imbued with liberal ideology and a concern to demonstrate the benefits of industrial civilization, and in particular, the development of railways. Chesson welcomed any measure that promised to boost transport. He could not accept that while engineers were using technology to smooth out obstacles to traffic, taxes were raising new ones. Just one example of these positions, the 1892 reform on rail fares. Chesson predicted a boom. it is impossible that tax reductions of such magnitude should not significantly stimulate traffic. Our engineer compared rail fares in France and other European countries. A comparison which, second quote, shows that the rebates of 1892 were neither foolhardy nor excessive, but that they had, on the contrary, become necessary to bring us up to the level of neighboring countries. And in the next edition of the album, the neutral stance was hardly maintained when Chesson noted that the railroad's revenue results had fulfilled the hopes of the friends of this reform and had foiled the pessimistic forecasts of its opponents. At last, in a lyrical flourish, Chesson considered that the reform will have immense consequences. A whole vast movement of exchanges must emerge from this. And its influence must extend to ideas and morals themselves. To work at low transport costs is to contribute to civilization, not less. We can thus see that the discourse of administrative statistics was not neutral. The images were inflected by comments and came sometimes in support of defined objectives. Chesson proposed reading keys in the profusion of images. If the data could speak for themselves, it was still useful to provide an interpreter, who was Chesson himself. With regard to readership, the albums had a dual target, a broad, cultivated public and certain circles of what we would call decision makers. I will come back to this one later. So firstly, the albums were part of the development of a visual culture aimed at a cultivated bourgeois audience, in the same way as the panels on display at World's fairs. It is worth recalling that the first album, published in 1879, included a number of plates that had appeared as wall maps at the Paris World Fair in 1878. I quote Chesson, "The large size of these plates was an advantage that made the statistical documents appreciated in the exhibition galleries." Similarly, some 20 maps taken from the albums were displayed on a wall at the 1889 World Fair, still in Paris. Above the panel were two large-scale maps, including the spectacular Accélération des voyages en France, an early example of cartographic anamorphosis. Chesson's notice for the 1889 album was reproduced in the form of a booklet for visitors of the exhibition to the section on his ministry. Album maps were also presented at geographical exhibitions, as in Venice in 1881. The link with the public was also reflected in the distribution of the album, which was sold in bookshops at a modest price, which only covered the cost of printing and binding. On several occasions, Chesson mentioned the public and the press as recipients of the albums, particularly when certain plates could be linked to current debates. For the public, the albums helped to objectify economic phenomena. The graphic method, as wrote Falguerol, transposes an abstract reality, the data, into a concrete fiction, its representation, making it easier to grasp. More generally, through a series of observation practices, production of figures, translation into a graphic language, and then their diffusion, the albums constructed statistical objects and made them intelligible. It created a public space for exchange enabling discussion of the indisputable, as Desrosiers puts it. However, the publication also targeted a more restricted readership of specialists. In addition to engineers and public works personnel, Chesson mentioned the economists, the statesmen, and the administrators. He also named, I quote, members of parliament for whom it is specially intended. Moreover, this use was explicitly related to the size of the book, as Chesson pointed out. As for the format of the album, it has been possible by a particular folding to bring it back to that of parliamentary documents, which is established by long use and by the convenience of its handling. The government and members of parliament will be able to take note of a large number of facts quickly and without the fatigue of reading long tables of figures. They will then be able to decide, I quote, at their own risk, wrote Chesson. He thus asserted this separation between the register of description and that of prescription. Was any album ever used to make a decision? This aspect is undocumented and remains hypothetical. However, there is ample evidence that it has been used in parliamentary settings. For the government, distributing the album was a sign of democratic transparency. As Minister Sadi Carnot said before the Senate in 1880, I quote, "My responsibility is too great for me not to seek to share it with the chambers and with the country by soliciting the scrutiny of public opinion at every opportunity. This is why I am constantly striving to shed light on the situation, either through statistics or monthly bulletins, or through all the albums of graphic statistics, which are distributed to you in this chamber as well as in the other." Loud applause. More generally, statistical maps have been used on several occasions in parliamentary debates on issues such as mortality, alcoholism, and of course, transport and railways. Yet a comic episode in the Chamber of Deputies illustrated the difficulty of using maps in democratic debate. The speaker: "Gentlemen, I would like you all to have before you this document. It is a figurative map of gross revenue per kilometer for all the railways in France. Here it is." The speaker unfurled the map measuring over 1 square meter in front of the gallery. I don't know if the House will be able to see various movements from various sides. It's impossible at this distance. Come for the Senate, the proceedings of the Senate. Well, I move to my last part, which is rather short. Far from seeing graphic statistics as a purely descriptive mode, Chesson always regarded it as a method of knowledge. For him, graphic procedures provided information quickly and accurately, but as he said, they enable us not only to see the whole series of phenomena at a glance, but also to point out their relationships or anomalies, to find their causes and to identify their laws. Additional knowledge was gained by bringing facts together, different phenomena in the same space, or the same phenomenon in different spaces or different times. The album's format, its manageability, and its serial nature opened up to the possibility of connecting information. Readers could carry out their analysis at the level of one plate, a single plate, observing the spatial intensity of one phenomenon. I quote Chesson, a single glance at the map, I'm sorry, it's the next one. A single glance at the map immediately shows the geographical distribution of the phenomenon under study, reveals its preferred places or affinities, and often even reveals its causes or laws. See that this is quite the same quotation as it was in 1878 regarding a single map. But then Chesson suggested comparing different maps from an album to note concordances or discordances. The system of comparable maps based on proportional deviations speaks to the mind as well as to the eyes. It points out anomalies to the reader, forcing him to be astonished, to seek, to reflect. It calls for comparisons between the various aspects of the same fact. It connects, by a close link, all the pages of the same atlas, which illuminate each other instead of being a simple juxtaposition of loose sheets. In the final stage, the idea was that connections could be made from one album to another one album to the next. In his comments, Chesson often mentioned maps from earlier albums, inviting reference to them. We will refrain, he said, from reproducing the 1876 map, which we will find in the 1880 album if we need to use it. This brings me to my conclusion on the limitations of the graphical method. We can smile at this claim to make sense of the maps. In reality, it's very complicated to connect anything in the albums. One reason is that the proposed method seems highly empirical and approximate. It also comes up against practical obstacles linked to the size of the maps and their folding system. Imagine how complicated it is to read and compare folded maps, sometimes with as many as 12 or 15 folds. Visual reasoning also suffers from the logical error known in sociology as the ecological fallacy, to attribute to an individual the characteristics of a group. So all these obstacles can explain that the statistical atlas died out at the beginning of the 20th century. It was imitated by several administrations in France, but they only published a limited number of volumes, to difference with the Ministry of Public Works. And the statistical atlas, as a sort of visual database, disappeared at the beginning of the 20th century in France. The main reason was financial. The work was expensive to produce and was largely distributed for free. Moreover, the inflation of statistical data made it increasingly difficult to translate them into graphic form. However, it's also possible that the graphical representations didn't quite live up to Chesson's expectations when he hoped it would be a new and effective method of analysis. The final observation is that of the limits of the statistical image as a method of knowledge. Administrative statistics was not a science of numbers. It relied only on elementary calculations and was far removed from the innovations of mathematical statistics. Map comparison was a poor substitute for the tools of statistical analysis, such as regression or correlation. The graphical method thus remained an auxiliary technique for formatting data. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilles.